The most disturbing observation that Rudolf Steiner repeatedly made in his investigations into the profound nature of human diseases and their true causes does not appear in any conventional medical treatise, nor is it taught in medical schools that operate exclusively within a materialist paradigm, assuming that the body is a biological machine subject only to physical and chemical laws without significant connection with psychological or spiritual states, but is dispersed throughout hundreds of lectures where he insisted with disturbing urgency that a substantial portion of the illnesses that afflict modern humanity, especially those categories of chronic and degenerative diseases that appear without obvious genetic or environmental causes that stubbornly resist conventional treatments, have their roots not in random malfunctioning of biological processes, but in fundamental misalignment between what a person's immortal soul has chosen to express in this particular incarnation and what current life is allowing or forcing the person to manifest, creating chronic tension between authentic impulses coming from the spiritual core of being and conscious personality behaviors and choices that often completely contradict intentions with which the soul descended into the material world, accepting all limitations and vulnerabilities of physical existence, precisely because it saw through from these limitations specific opportunities for development that only incarnation allows, but which require that life be lived in ways that honor authentic purposes, rather than systematically betraying them through conformity to social expectations or through serving ego fears and ambitions that have nothing to do with real reasons. Why this particular soul is here now in this body, in this family, in this historical epoch. When a person lives for years or decades in fundamental contradiction with these purposes, making choices day after day that move in the opposite direction of where the soul wants to go, he does not just experience psychological dissatisfaction or vague regrets about paths not taken, but creates through very specific mechanisms that Steiner mapped with anatomical precision conditions in subtle bodies that must eventually manifest themselves in the physical body as measurable symptoms, because tension between emotional and material spiritual levels cannot be maintained indefinitely without consequences that finally force confrontation with truths that were being avoided through distractions and rationalizations that worked for time, but that eventually prove insufficient to maintain life structures that are built on foundations of self-betrayal that are inherently unstable and that therefore must collapse at some point, creating crises that are simultaneously disasters and opportunities. Because although they are painful, they are also necessary interruptions of unsustainable trajectories, forcing reconsideration of fundamental life. Directions. Before it is too late to make changes that could restore alignment between soul and existence. The conceptual framework through which Steiner understood these processes begins with the recognition that the human being is not just the visible physical body that conventional medicine studies, but is a complex organization of multiple interpenetrating bodies or vehicles, each operating according to its own laws in its own dimension, but all connected through precise relationships that, when they are harmonious, allow for integral health. But when they are misaligned, they create cascading dysfunctions, where problems at higher levels eventually rush to lower levels, finally manifesting as physical pathologies that have real material components that can be measured and treated, but which cannot be truly cured without addressing root causes that reside in dimensions that ordinary medical instruments do not detect, because they operate beyond frequencies of dense matter into realms of formative forces and emotional consciousness and spiritual impulses that, although invisible to ordinary sensory perception, are as real as physical structures, and in fact are more fundamental because they are causes from which physical effects emerge rather than just being epiphenomena of brain processes, as materialism erroneously assumes. The four main levels of this hierarchical organization are: first, dense physical body composed of ordinary material substances, subject to laws of physics and chemistry that can be studied through conventional scientific methods. Second, etheric, or vital body, which is organization of formative forces that keep physical body operating as a living organism instead of disintegrating according to natural tendencies of inorganic matter, constantly working against entropy through processes that defy. Second law of thermodynamics, maintaining order and organization that characterize life differentiating from death where etheric forces exist. Ethereum, allowing the physical body to finally follow purely physical laws, decomposing rapidly. Third, astral body, which is a vehicle of sensorial and emotional consciousness, allowing not only biological life, such as plants, but subjective experience of pleasure and pain, desires and aversions, feelings and sensations that characterize the soul life of animals. And humans, and fourth self, or immortal spirit, which is the core of self-conscious individuality that persists through multiple incarnations, bringing continuity of purposes and developments that transcend any singular life, connecting person, not only with the past of previous lives, but also with the future of developments that have yet to be realized through subsequent incarnations. Under ideal conditions, these 4 levels operate in harmonious coordination, where impulses from self flow freely through astral body to etheric body, and finally to physical body, manifesting spiritual intentions in material actions without blockages or significant distortions, and where sensory information from the external world flows in reverse direction from physical body through etheric body and astral body to self-allowing individual consciousness to know and respond appropriately to conditions of external reality through perceptions that are faithfully translated through layers providing accurate representations that allow effective world navigation. Material. But when person lives against soul by making choices that systematically contradict purposes with which self has chosen to embody this harmony, is severely disturbed by creating conflicts between levels, where self is sending impulses in certain directions, but conscious personality, which is only a small fraction of total self, is blocking or distorting these impulses through choices motivated by other factors, which have no connection with authentic soul intentions, conformity to family or cultural, expectations which have never been critically questioned, seeking social approval or material success which are valued by culture but which are not. They serve real needs for spiritual development, avoidance of risks or discomforts that would be necessary to face if a person lived authentically, or simply inertia to continue in established patterns, because changing would require effort and courage that seem not to be available, even when the cost of not changing is progressively greater as years pass and opportunities are lost and vitality is drained through maintaining performance that contradicts essence. When this conflict between self-impulses and personality choices is chronically maintained over years, creating a permanent state of inner civil war where different parts of being are pulling in opposite directions, the first level where damage manifests is the astral body, which becomes the battlefield between conflicting forces. On the one hand, authentic soul impulses trying to express themselves according to the original plan of incarnation. On the other hand, ego resistances based on fears, and conditioning and ambitions that contradict the original plan. And this constant tension in the astral body, which should be the vehicle through of which consciousness operates quietly, becomes instead a source of chronic emotional turmoil, manifesting as persistent anxiety with no clear external cause, because anxiety is coming from inner conflict between what one is doing and what soul knows one should be doing, or as deep depression, where nothing brings genuine joy because inner source of vitality that is connection to authentic purpose has been blocked through years of making choices that move in the opposite direction, or as disproportionate irritability where small triggers provoke intense reactions, because tolerance is depleted by chronic stress of maintaining division between performed public self and private self that is suppressed but does not disappear just because it is denied, continuing to press for expression, creating tension that eventually explodes in ways that are often destructive because it has not found constructive outlets through deliberate changes in life. This chaos in the astral body, if not resolved by restoring alignment between levels through making changes in life that honor authentic soul impulses, eventually transmits itself to the etheric body, which is responsible for maintaining harmoniously organized life processes. But when it receives conflicting and chaotic instructions from the astral body, it begins to function in distorted ways, where certain systems receive excessive energy, while others are deprived, creating imbalances that are initially subtle and compensable, but which, when maintained long enough, become severe and eventually irreversible, manifesting as chronic fatigue that does not improve with rest, because it is not primarily physical, but is a depletion of vital forces that have been consumed in maintaining contradiction between levels, or with increased vulnerability to infections, because the immune system that depends on the vitality of the etheric body to function properly is compromised when etheric forces are disorganized by astral conflicts, or as digestive or metabolic problems that do not have clear organic causes, but that reflect disturbances in processes that the etheric body coordinates when it is healthy, but that disorganize when the etheric body is under stress from having to mediate conflicts that it should not have to mediate if there were harmony between soul and life. Finally, when disturbances in the etheric body are maintained long enough without resolution, they eventually manifest in the physical body as pathologies that have material components that are completely real and measurable through medical examinations. Tumors that grow when cell division processes that the etheric body normally regulates become uncontrolled, chronic inflammations that persist when immune responses that should be temporary become permanent, tissue degenerations that occur when regenerative forces that the etheric body provides are no longer sufficient to maintain necessary repairs or breakdowns. of entire systems, when organs that have been forced to operate under conditions of chronic stress finally exhaust compensatory capabilities and fail in ways that are acute and dramatic, finally forcing attention that should have been given much earlier when signs were still subtle and reversible. The timing of when these physical manifestations emerge is not random, but often corresponds to specific biographical moments that have particular significance. Decade anniversaries that force reflection on how much time was spent living in ways that betray the soul, deaths of parents or others that confront mortality, and questions of whether life is being lived in ways that will be satisfying to look back on from a deathbed, divorces or other endings of relationships that were central to identity-forcing reconstruction of who the person is when external structures are removed, retirements or other ends of careers that were primary sources of meaning and structure leaving voids that reveal that there was no inner substance to sustain when external roles end, or simply achieving goals that were supposed to bring satisfaction but that turn out to be empty, confirming growing suspicion that success by conventional standards is not enough if there is no alignment with authentic purposes that only the soul knows because they are unique to each individual and cannot be determined through comparisons with others, nor through following cultural prescriptions about what a successful life should look like. The specific forms that illnesses take when they emerge from living against the soul often have symbolic or metaphorical qualities that, when recognized, reveal connections between physical symptoms and psychological or spiritual conflicts that are root causes. A person who feels burdened with responsibilities that they did not want to take on but accepted because they cannot say no, developing back problems, especially low back, where they literally can no longer carry weights what body is. Symbolically expressing what soul is experiencing of being forced to carry burdens that are not theirs. Person who is in a relationship or work that they feel is toxic, but that they cannot leave due to fear or guilt, developing digestive or liver problems, as if the body is trying to process and eliminate toxins that the person cannot eliminate from their life through making necessary choices to end situations that are poisonous. Person who has important things to say, but who constantly censors themselves to maintain peace or approval, developing throat or thyroid problems, as if the ability to express themselves is being physically blocked, reflecting the psychological block of not allowing the truth to be spoken. Person who refuses to see truths about a situation that they prefer to deny, developing vision problems that literally prevent them from seeing clearly, as well as psychologically preventing themselves from seeing clearly. A person who does not want to hear what their inner voice is saying or what others are trying to communicate, developing hearing problems that physically block what is being blocked psychologically through not wanting to hear messages that are inconvenient or disturbing. These symbolic correspondences are not interpretative fantasies, arbitrarily imposed on symptoms that have purely physical causes, but emerge spontaneously when people are invited to explore personal meanings of illnesses through questions such as, if your symptom could say what it would be saying about your life, or what in your life can you not digest, see, hear, carry, express, often revealing surprising insights into connections between physical manifestations and life situations that were not conscious before, but that once recognized seem obviously related, suggesting that the body in its wisdom is expressing through the language of symptoms what the conscious mind is not willing to recognize through the language of words, because recognition would imply having to make changes that are frightening even when they are necessary. The therapeutic function of illness, then, is not just to force treatment of physical symptoms that are urgent and require appropriate medical attention, but to create a crisis that interrupts the automatic functioning of the life that was being lived without question, forcing a stop where there is finally time and need to deeply examine whether the life that was being lived before becoming ill was the life that the soul really wanted to live, or whether it was a performance of a script that was prescribed by others without ever having been consciously chosen as an authentic expression of purposes and values that really matter when all layers of conditioning are removed, revealing the essential core of who a person is. It really is beneath social roles and constructed identities that are useful for world navigation, but that should not be confused with the totality of being that is much broader and deeper than any particular role can contain. The integral healing work that Steiner proposed is not just treating the physical body through medications or surgeries that are sometimes necessary to stabilize acute conditions, but is working simultaneously on multiple levels to restore harmony between the astral, etheric, physical body and self through a combination of interventions that include first anthroposophic medical treatments that use substances prepared in ways that preserve and even amplify vital forces rather than just extracting active chemical components as conventional pharmaceuticals do, working with metals and plants and minerals that have specific affinities with particular organs and processes, chemically but energetically through correspondences between macrocosm and microcosm that materialistic medicine ignores, but that holistic medicine of all traditions has always recognized as fundamental. Second aspect is work with eurythmy, which is an art of movement developed by Steiner specifically to work with formative forces of the etheric body through gestures that correspond to speech sounds, and which, when practiced regularly, have the effect of reorganizing etheric currents that have been disorganized by conflicts, creating greater harmony and fluidity in vital processes, allowing the etheric body to fulfill appropriate functions of keeping the physical body healthy instead of constantly being in crisis mode, trying to compensate for imbalances that come from higher levels. Third aspect is therapeutic artistic work through painting, sculpture, music, or other forms that allow expression of dimensions of self that do not find outlets in everyday life, providing channels through which damned energies can flow instead of being blocked internally, creating congestions that eventually manifest as symptoms, and that through creating external forms, one learns to work consciously with the same formative forces that operate internally, organizing the etheric body, giving greater mastery over processes that are normally only automatic and involuntary. Fourth crucial aspect is psychotherapy or counseling, which is not just talking about problems, but is deep investigation of biographical patterns, identifying where and when a person began to deviate from the authentic path-making choices that served security or approval, but that betrayed genuine soul impulses, tracing consequences of these choices through years of seeing how each deviation led to the next, until the person found himself in a life that he did not recognize as his own living on. Autopilot, executing routines that someone programmed but that had no connection with who he really is, and working to identify what changes would be necessary to restore alignment, even when changes are big and scary, recognizing that the cost of not doing is greater than the cost of doing when health and vitality and whole life integrity are at stake. Fifth aspect that permeates all others is development of inner life through meditation and contemplation, which are not optional spiritual luxuries, but are absolute necessities to maintain conscious connection with deeper levels of being, where soul purposes reside beneath the noise of superficial thoughts and everyday concerns that dominate ordinary consciousness, preventing access to inner wisdom that knows what one really needs to do even when conscious mind is confused or frightened, creating, through regular practice, quiet space where soul voice can be heard without interference from all other voices that have opinions about how life should be lived, but which have no ultimate authority. Because only the individual soul knows the unique purposes with which it has chosen to incarnate, and therefore only the soul can determine whether life is being lived in ways that serve these purposes, or is being wasted in pursuing goals that are valued by culture, but which have no intrinsic meaning for this particular individuality. The perspective that Steiner's understanding offers on the meaning of illnesses that emerge when a person lives against the soul completely transforms the relationship with suffering, from being just a victim of bad luck or random biological failures to being a participant in an educational process that, although painful, also has the purpose of forcing confrontation with truths that were being avoided and of catalyzing changes that were necessary but that would never be made voluntarily because fear of change was too strong, keeping the person trapped in life structures that were safe but that were also prisons, progressively killing vitality through years of conforming to expectations that never were questioned nor consciously chosen. Body pays the bill, not as arbitrary punishment for moral sins, but as a natural consequence of laws that govern relationships between dimensions of human being, where disharmony at higher levels must eventually manifest at lower levels when not resolved through conscious changes in life, restoring alignment between spiritual purposes and material manifestations, and where restoration of harmony through making appropriate changes creates healing possibilities that exceed what would be expected from a purely materialistic perspective. Because body is not a deterministic machine following only trajectories of deterioration, but is living organism responsive to change and total conditions, including psychological and spiritual conditions that, when improved, allow regeneration, which demonstrates that health does not depend only on physical factors, but fundamentally depends on alignment between all dimensions of being operating harmoniously, instead of being in chronic conflict that drains vitality and creates multiple vulnerabilities. The most pressing practical question that arises from recognizing that illnesses may have roots in living against the soul is how a person can discern what the soul really wants versus what are just ego desires or escapist fantasies that have no real substance, because it is not always obvious which inner voice is authentic, especially when a person has spent so long disconnected from the true self through living in automatic conformity that they have completely lost touch with what they really want beneath all the layers of conditioning. Steiner offered several guidelines for this discernment, beginning with the observation that authentic soul urges have certain qualities that distinguish them from superficial ego desires They tend to be persistent over time. Rather than just passing whims that constantly change, they tend to bring a sense of expansion in life when they are imagined, even when they also bring fear because they require change. They connect with deeper values and a sense of greater purpose rather than just being about personal gratification or material advantage. They often involve serving or contributing to others or to greater causes rather than of being purely self-centered. And when one finally acts on them, there is experience of, yes, this is right, even when it is difficult, in contrast to the feeling of emptiness that comes from achieving goals that were motivated only by ego and discovering that expected satisfaction does not materialize because the object of desire was not actually what the soul was seeking. Another method of discernment is to pay attention to what brings genuine vitality versus what drains it. Activities or relationships or environments that leave a person feeling more alive and energized even when they are challenging versus those that leave a person feeling drained and dead even when they are superficially pleasant. And by tracking these patterns over time, a person can identify what truly nourishes versus what merely distracts or anesthetizes without providing real nourishment. For the soul that is starving for authentic experiences and genuine expressions of the unique capabilities that only this individuality possesses. Third method is to work with dreams, which according to Steiner are windows into deeper dimensions of being, where soul expresses itself in language of symbols and images, which, when interpreted appropriately, reveal truths that waking consciousness is avoiding or denying. Paying attention especially to recurring dreams or themes that appear repeatedly over years, that often point to issues that soul is trying to bring to attention, but the conscious personality is systematically ignoring, because they would imply having to make changes that are inconvenient. IANTS. Fourth method is practical experimentation, where instead of trying to discover through analysis what the soul wants, one simply begins to do small experiments, with living in more authentic ways in areas where changes are possible, even if they are not yet the most significant, devoting regular time, even if minimal, to activities that bring genuine joy without the need to justify it through usefulness, honestly expressing, at least in some safe contexts, thoughts and feelings that are normally censored, making choices based on what one really wants rather than on what one thinks one should want or on what others expect, even in small matters. Carefully observing how these changes affect not only emotional state, but also physical symptoms that can improve when there is movement toward alignment, even when movement is modest, suggesting that direction is more important than magnitude, at least initially, and that small, consistent steps accumulate into significant transformations when maintained over time. The final invitation that Steiner's teaching about body paying the bill for living against soul offers is not just to individuals who are sick, but to everyone who is living in a culture that systematically values conformity and material success above authenticity and spiritual development by creating conditions where it is extremely difficult to live in soul-honoring ways because social and economic structures are organized in ways that reward specific types of behavior that serve the system, but that often contradict individual souls' needs to express themselves for unique purposes that do not fit into standardized categories of careers and lifestyles that are offered as legitimate options. Necessary transformation, therefore, is not just individual, but is collective, requiring changes in how society as a whole is organized to create more spaces and possibilities for diversity of life paths that honor the fact that each soul is unique with specific purposes that cannot be reduced to general formulas nor forced to conform to standards that serve economic efficiency, but that sacrifice human well-being and spiritual development at the altar of productivity and growth that are valued. Absolutely without question as to whether they truly serve the flourishing of complete human beings operating in all dimensions, physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual values that must all be nurtured if full health is to be possible, rather than just the temporary absence of severe symptoms, while root causes of imbalance continue to operate inexorably toward future manifestations that will be progressively more severe if fundamental patterns are not transformed through real changes in how individual and collective life is organized. Until such cultural changes happen, which may take generations, individuals who recognize through their own experience of becoming ill that body is paying the bill for living versus soul are challenged to make difficult choices between continuing the conformity that allows social functioning at the cost of health and vitality versus making changes that honor the soul even when they are risky or inconvenient. But understanding that illnesses are not random accidents but are intelligent. Communications from deeper dimensions of being can provide the courage needed to make changes, recognizing that although changes are frightening, the alternative of continuing on a trajectory that is killing not just the body but soul is unacceptable when both options are seen clearly without illusions about the costs of each path. The promise is not that making changes will eliminate all problems, nor that perfect health will automatically be restored, because there are multiple factors that influence health, and not all are under the direct control of present choices. But it is that movement toward greater authenticity creates conditions where the body no longer needs to scream through symptoms, because messages are being heard and life is being progressively adjusted to honor soul needs, rather than constantly betraying them, and that even when complete physical healing is not possible, there is healing on a deeper level that comes from living with integrity, knowing that you are doing your best to honor both. Practical needs of survival and deeper needs of the soul to express itself, according to purposes with which it chose to incarnate, accepting all limitations and vulnerabilities of material existence, precisely because through these limitations, paradoxically, unique possibilities of development become available that would not exist in dimensions where everything is fluid without resistances that force growth of capabilities through having to work with and through obstacles, transforming what appears to be just suffering and opportunities for development when understood and worked appropriately through recognizing that the body that is paying the bill is not the enemy, but is the ally, trying to urgently communicate that changes are needed before it is too late to make corrections that could save not only physical life, but soul life that is being wasted through years of living in contradiction with inner truth that can never be betrayed indefinitely without consequences that eventually force confrontation with fundamental choice between continuing in self-betrayal that is unsustainable or having the courage to live authentically even when it is difficult, trusting that this is the only form of true integrity that allows for health not just as the absence of symptoms, but as the presence of vitality that flows when there is alignment between all dimensions of being operating harmoniously in service of purposes that give meaning to life, transforming existence from mere survival into a journey of conscious development where each experience, including experiences of illness, contributes to progressive soul education through multiple lifetimes toward expanded capabilities that are the evolutionary destiny of humanity when proper development is accomplished through honoring inner truth rather than systematically betraying it by serving false teachers of fear and conformity that promise security but deliver only the slow death of everything that makes life worth living. The essential message that remains clear throughout the complexity of teachings is that body paying the bill when person lives against soul is not divine punishment, nor is it evidence of moral failure, but is simply the operation of natural laws that govern relationships between dimensions of being human where harmony creates health and disharmony creates illness, and that although these laws are inexorable in operation, they are also compassionate in intention because through forcing confrontation with contradictions that were being maintained through denial and distraction, they create opportunities to make changes that restore integrity before it is absolutely too late. And that recognizing body as messenger rather than as enemy transforms relationship with illness from struggle to eliminate symptoms as quickly as possible to curious listening, asking what body is trying to communicate about imbalances in life as a totality that must be addressed if true healing is to occur, rather than just temporary suppression of manifestations that will return in possibly worse forms if root causes are not transformed through genuine changes in consciousness and in life that emerge when person has the courage to listen to what soul is saying through all available channels, including bodily symptoms. Channel which are last resorts when all other warnings have been systematically ignored, but which, when finally given the attention they deserve, open up possibilities for transformations that go far beyond just restoring physical health, including lifelong transformation from superficial performance of prescribed scripts to authentic expression of unique purposes that only the soul can manifest by contributing something irreducible and irreplaceable to the totality of human experience that would be impoverished if any genuine voice were silenced through forced conformity to standards that serve system, but that betray individual souls that are real and that matter. Infinitely more than any social structure that exists only to serve well-being of the people who compose it, and which therefore must be transformed when it is not serving this fundamental purpose, rather than sacrificing people on the altar of preserving systems that do not justify loyalties that demand, when costs include not only psychological unhappiness, but physical deterioration, and eventually premature death of bodies that could have lived much longer and much more healthily if lives had been lived in alignment with soul, rather than in contradiction, creating unsustainable tensions that must eventually break down in ways that are tragic, but that are also predictable, when laws that govern relationships between spirit and matter are understood, revealing that the body actually pays the bill, but that the bill need not be as high as it often is if warnings are heeded early, when changes are still relatively easy, rather than being ignored until crises force changes that are much more difficult and painful, but that are eventually inevitable because The soul does not give up trying to express itself, and the body cannot maintain indefinitely contradictions that violate fundamental laws of its own nature, as an instrument through which immortal spirit temporarily manifests itself in the material world for specific developmental purposes that require that instrument is used in ways that honor original design and intent in, rather than being abused through forcing it to serve. Purposes that completely contradict reasons why it was created, resulting eventually in breakdown, which, although disastrous, is also final communication that limits have been exceeded, and that restoration requires not only technical repairs, but fundamental reconsideration of how the instrument is being used, and whether current use actually serves authentic purposes, or is merely serving agendas that are imposed externally without genuine consent of the soul, which is the true owner of the body, and which therefore has ultimate authority over how it should be used, even when this authority is often usurped by ego that assumes control without recognizing that it is only temporary administrator and not true owner who is immortal soul that persists through all temporary changes of bodies and personalities, maintaining continuity of purposes that transcend any particular manifestation, connecting person not only with past of previous lives, but also with future of developments that have yet to be, realized through patient work of multiple incarnations, each contributing unique steps in journey that is far greater than any single life can encompass. But that each life serves when lived authentically in alignment with inner truth, that is voice of soul constantly whispering directions that when followed lead not necessarily to an easy life, but to a life that is authentic, and therefore the only life worth living when all alternatives of living in contradiction are honestly considered, including costs that the body pays when the soul is betrayed systematically through years of making choices that serve the wrong masters, eventually resulting in illnesses that are simultaneously tragedies and opportunities, depending on whether they are used as awakenings to make necessary changes or are merely treated symptomatically, allowing a return to patterns that created problems in the first place, ensuring that future manifestations will be even worse as causes continue to operate no real. Transformation, just temporary suppressions that delay the inevitable, but also allow it to build up to levels that eventually become catastrophic, when it could have been addressed much sooner with much less suffering if warnings had been heeded when they were still gentle rather than ignored, until they had to become screams that can no longer be ignored, finally forcing attention that should have been given voluntarily long before saving years of unnecessary suffering that comes from insisting on living against soul. When living with soul is always option available to those who have the courage to choose authenticity over conformity, even when choice is difficult and frightening, because it requires abandoning known securities and taking risks in the unknown, trusting that soul knows the way, even when ego is confused and scared because soul has perspective that transcends singular life, seeing complete arc of development through multiple lives, while ego sees only fragment of present moment. Without understanding larger context within which current life makes sense as chapter in much longer story that is being written across eons, and that will eventually be understood in totality, revealing that nothing has been wasted, and that every experience, including experiences of suffering, served educational purposes that contributed to development of capacities that are permanent inheritance of soul that persist when temporary body is finally abandoned at end of life, freeing soul to return to spiritual dimensions, carrying with it fruits of incarnation. Experiences that, if life was lived authentically, include genuine developments of consciousness that serve continued evolution toward expanded capacities that are destiny of all humanity, when appropriate work is done through honoring inner truth rather than betraying it by serving only external appearances that have no real substance or lasting value when measured against standards of spiritual development that are the only true criteria of success in human life, which is not just about accumulating things or achieving status, but is about developing qualities of consciousness and expression that contribute to the evolution of a totality that transcends, but also includes all individual manifestations, each being necessary and valuable when it is authentic, contributing unique perspective that no other can duplicate. Exactly, because each soul is an irreducible uniqueness that cannot be replaced, demonstrating that living against the soul is not just a personal problem, but is a loss to the totality that is impoverished when any authentic voice is silenced through conformity that denies oneness in favor of uniformity that serves efficiency, but sacrifices diversity that is true, richness of collective human experience. That